Welcome to the complete guide to the windmill exercise. I'm Jenny and this is Travis, and we are the co-founders of Strength for Yoga. And we wanted to take a little time today to focus on the windmill exercise. And this is a foundational kettlebell exercise, but it also has some overlap with yoga, as you'll see once we get into it. So our plan for today is we're going to talk about the anatomy and the biomechanics of the windmill exercise. And then we're going to present for you our favorite Strength for Yoga variations of the windmill, which are really awesome too.
That's right.
So what's the windmill?
So the windmill is an exercise that comes from the kettlebell community. You could do it with a dumbbell, but it just happens to be more popular, I think, with a kettlebell. And it looks like this. So Jenny takes like a little bit wider than shoulder width stance with her lower body. She has her toes kind of oriented obliquely at an angle. And then she presses up with the kettlebell and she hinges at her hips and slides her hand down her inner thigh and looks at the kettlebell all the while. So what you can see going on here is we have kind of like a hip hinge, almost like a deadlift, but like very much prioritized on the one side. And we also
On
have
this front leg, right?
and we also have a side bend going on as well. Plus, we have this great shoulder stability from overhead and then kind of off to the side. We get a really nice stretch through the adductors or the muscles on the inner thigh as well as the hamstrings.
And then back here too, right?
Yeah,
Like a little stretch to this lateral hip.
right. Yeah. And a cue that my friend Jen Sinkler taught me that I really like is to think about that outside hip. She says like a sassy hip. So if you're having trouble like feeling the movement in your body, like think about pushing that hip out to the side.
That totally makes sense. Yeah, that emphasizes that action.
Yeah.
So this would be kind of like the classic setup for the windmill, like what you just talked us into. But then we have like another way that you might practice the windmill, which has a little more of that yoga overlap we were talking about.
Right. So maybe your movement eyes could pick up on this, but if you imagine not holding the kettlebell and just doing triangle pose in yoga, like we typically hold this shape for a little while, right? We might do some other things in it, but this is basically the same as a windmill minus the kettlebell and with a longer stance. So at Strength for Yoga, we thought, well, why not turn that into an exercise that we perform for repetitions like a kettlebell windmill? So Jenny takes her wide stance.
It's wider than the traditional.
Yeah, and she might have her left feet angled more along the edge of the mat, like parallel with it. So whereas the toes were like this before, now they're kind of more obliquely oriented at like a 90-degree angle. And then she does the same thing. So presses up overhead. This leg stays pretty straight, the outside leg, or entirely straight. The left leg probably has a little bit of bend in it, depending on your flexibility. And then she does her side bends looking at the kettlebell the whole time.
So this is kind of like a loaded triangle.
This is definitely
Loaded trikonasana, or our yoga pose.
Definitely a loaded triangle. The other slight difference between this one is like you're staying pretty much in the triangle variation in that frontal plane. Whereas in the kettlebell windmill variation where your stance is a little more narrow, I think you get a little bit more transverse plane, like
Rotation.
yeah, rotation of the thoracic spine to get into the bottom position.
Right. And so we find like in our Strength for Yoga programs, when we teach the windmill, we tend to do a little more of the triangle variation. It's a little more relevant for our yoga audience, but both variations are great.
Yeah, if you can do a loaded triangle, right, for repetitions with 10, 15, 20 pounds over your head, then it makes holding the bottom of triangle without weight pretty easy. Right?
Triangle feels like no big deal at all.
So you're building some strength, which should help you access that pose more easily.
Exactly. So what are some other variations of the windmill that we like?
Yeah, so we've shown the regular variation, we've shown the more yoga variation. Now we can show a couple of different ways to load the exercise. So regardless of whether you're doing the regular, like slightly narrower stance or the wider stance, you can instead of holding a kettlebell overhead, you can hold a kettlebell in the bottom hand. You would still reach the arm overhead and probably look at that hand with your gaze just to practice, to reinforce. But now Jenny just slides that kettlebell down her thigh, holding that weight. And so there are a couple of cool things going on. One, she can probably go heavier with the kettlebell in the bottom hand than she could in the top hand. And two, I just actually find that sometimes for people who are struggling with like feeling out the top loaded one, the bottom loaded one, just like it feels easier to find that movement and that, kind of sassy hip, prioritizing the one side of the body in the hinge a little bit.
Maybe because in that bottom loaded variation, the load is like more proximal, like to your center, whereas in the top, it's like way out here. So maybe it's just a little easier to proprioception and feel.
Yeah. So even though we showed that version third, I think for some people that might be a nice place to start.
Totally.
For someone who is wanting to add more load, but not necessarily able to handle a really heavy weight overhead, you can do both the top and bottom loads. So now, Jenny, the bottom load will be the heavier one. You could use the same weight maybe, but most people can use a heavier weight on bottom and a little bit of a lighter weight on top. And now we combine. So we look at the top hand, but we have the bottom hand with the weight as well, and we perform our windmills.
Yes. So this is the top and bottom loaded windmill, whereas the last one was just the bottom loaded.
Right.
And a typical windmill is just top loaded.
Yep. So cool way to add load and still be able to handle the heavy weight just by loading both hands at the same time.
Exactly, Travis. So we have more windmill variations.
Yeah, we have,
and these ones I especially love.
2 more variations for you. And these both occur in low lunge or a half kneeling position. So for this one, Jenny has the weight in the hand of the up leg. So she's now in this half kneeling position, low lunge. And what she's going to do, she'll always keep her eyes on the kettlebell, and she's just going to tap the floor with her hand as option 1, or she could go all the way down to her elbow if her mobility allows. So this is a lot of thoracic spine rotation. It's also some good work through the hips. And so it kind of takes the lower body a little bit out of it, but you can still see how it's very windmill-like.
Yes. And I love it because whereas the other windmill we were showing is kind of triangle pose, like overlaps with triangle. This overlaps with like low lunge in yoga, at least for me as like a yoga person. So this feels like a really great way to add load and different movement in low lunge, which regular old low lunge can get a little boring.
For sure. So then we have one more wrinkle on that low lunge windmill, which involves actually pressing the kettlebell up overhead as you descend down into the bottom position. So Jenny starts with the kettlebell in her front rack, and then as she lowers, she presses overhead. So this is a little bit more dynamic, whereas before we were just holding the weight overhead stable. Now we're getting a press into it. And this is a nice introduction to a kettlebell exercise that we won't show today, but it's called the bent press. And it's kind of like you start here and then the kettlebell stays relatively in position, but you go down into something like a windmill, and then the kettlebell is in the top position, and then you stand up with it. So the kettlebell community likes to do that exercise as a way to overhead press like more than they could actually overhead press just standing here, because it's actually an eccentric overhead press.
It's kind of a trick.
Yeah, it's a trick. It's a strength trick because the kettlebell stays in the same place and you're just kind of squatting underneath
and
it.
that kind of happens in this.
Same general idea. Yep.
Yeah, so do you think that kind of wraps up all of our variations we wanted to present? We showed the traditional kind of narrow stance windmill. We showed the longer, more triangle stance. We showed bottom loaded only, bottom and top loaded, and then we showed the 2 low lunge windmills.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you can never run out of fun ways to progress the exercise, regress the exercise, just subtly switch it up so you can keep triangle or loaded triangle or windmill in your practice all the time.
100%. And if you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on all of the content that we share.